The front door of Merrick Manor creaked open under Thomas's weathered hand, releasing the scent of old wood and something else, something that made his throat tighten with recognition he couldn't name. He stepped across the threshold, his boots echoing against marble floors that gleamed as if they'd been polished that very morning. "Hello." His voice carried through the grand foyer, bouncing off familiar portraits and up the sweeping staircase. "Mrs. Blackwood?" "Samuel?" The silence that answered wasn't empty. It was thick, expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Thomas set down his traveling bag and removed his coat, hanging it on the same brass hook he'd used as a boy. Everything looked exactly as he remembered from 15 years ago, the Persian rug beneath his feet, the grandfather clock in the corner, even the way afternoon light slanted through the tall windows. Yet something fundamental had shifted, like a melody played in the wrong key. He moved deeper into the house, his fingers trailing along the polished banister. "Samuel, I received your letter. I'm here." The words felt hollow in the stillness. His younger brother had written urgently about estate matters, about things that needed discussing in person. Thomas had expected to find Samuel waiting, perhaps in their father's old study, surrounded by ledgers and legal documents. Instead, he found rooms that looked lived in but felt abandoned. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the parlor table, still warm to the touch. Fresh flowers filled the vases, white lilies that shouldn't have been blooming in November. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but Thomas couldn't remember seeing smoke from the chimney when he'd approached the house. "This is absurd," he muttered, checking the dining room. Place settings for two waited on the mahogany table, as if someone had expected him for dinner. Silver gleamed, crystal caught the light, and yet the air tasted of dust and neglect. Thomas ran his finger along the table's edge and it came away clean. Too clean. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step producing that same hollow echo. The portraits of dead Merricks watched him pass, stern men with dark eyes and severe expressions, generation after generation of firstborn sons who'd inherited this place and all its responsibilities. Thomas paused before his grandfather's painting, remembering how the old man's gaze had always seemed to follow him as a child. "Even you're keeping secrets now," he said to the canvas. His childhood bedroom door stood ajar. Inside, everything remained exactly as he'd left it at 18, books on the shelves, clothes in the wardrobe, even the wooden toy soldiers he'd played with as a boy. But the bed was made with fresh linens, and someone had placed a single white lily on his pillow. Thomas backed out of the room, unease crawling up his spine like cold fingers. He tried Samuel's room next, but found it empty, the bed unslept in for days. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and the air held that peculiar stillness of spaces long abandoned. Where was everyone? Mrs. Blackwood had served the family for decades, she would never simply disappear. And Samuel, impulsive, unreliable Samuel, had never left the estate for more than a day in his entire life. He'd been born in these halls, educated by private tutors, and had taken over the estate's management after their father's death 5 years prior. Thomas descended to the kitchen, hoping to find some evidence of recent habitation. He found it, but not what he expected. Bread sat fresh on the counter, still warm from the oven. Vegetables had been chopped for soup, the knife still resting beside neat piles of carrots and onions. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with the smell of beef broth and herbs. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called again, louder this time. His voice cracked slightly. "Where is everyone?" He lifted the pot's lid and steam rose to fog his vision momentarily. When it cleared, he noticed something that made his blood turn cold. The soup was prepared for 3 people, 3 bowls waited beside the stove, 3 spoons laid out with military precision. But there were only supposed to be 2 people in the house. Himself and Samuel. Thomas abandoned the kitchen and headed for the back of the house, toward the conservatory and the gardens beyond. Perhaps Samuel was outside, tending to the grounds as he often did when troubled. The conservatory doors stood open to the November air, letting in the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter. He stepped onto the terrace and immediately saw the oak tree. The great sprawling giant had stood sentinel over the Merrick grounds for over a century, its branches wide enough to shade half the back lawn. Thomas had climbed those branches as a boy, had carved his initials into the trunk alongside Samuel's. Now something else hung from those branches. Thomas's legs carried him forward without conscious thought. The figure swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, feet dangling 2 feet above the frost-covered grass. Dark hair, familiar clothes, the lean-build Thomas remembered from their last meeting 5 years ago. Samuel. The name escaped his lips as a whisper. His brother hung from a thick rope tied to the oak's strongest branch. His face, turned away from the house, was gray and still. His hands, which should have been clawing at the rope, hung limp at his sides. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chair or ladder below. Just Samuel, suspended in the November air like some macabre ornament. Thomas circled the tree, bile rising in his throat. Samuel's eyes were closed, his expression almost peaceful. But his skin had that waxy quality that spoke of days, not hours. This hadn't happened recently. His brother had been hanging here for at least 3 days, maybe more. Dear God, Thomas breathed, reaching up toward the body before catching himself. He shouldn't disturb the scene. There would be questions, investigations. The constable would need to see everything exactly as it was. But even as these practical thoughts ran through his mind, another realization crept in like poison. If Samuel had been dead for days, who had been maintaining the house? Who had prepared the fresh bread, arranged the flowers, made his bed with clean linens? Who had lit the fires and set the table for dinner? Thomas backed away from the tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. The house loomed behind him, its windows gleaming like watching eyes. Smoke still rose from the chimneys. Lights glowed warm and welcoming in several rooms. From this distance, Merrick Manor looked like the picture of domestic tranquility, a home where a family might gather for evening dinner, where children might play in the halls, where love and laughter had once echoed through every room. But Thomas knew better now. He'd seen the truth hanging from the oak tree, and that truth poisoned everything else. The warm bread wasn't welcoming, it was wrong. The fresh flowers weren't beautiful, they were impossible. The house wasn't greeting his return, it was hiding something terrible behind its familiar facade. As he stared at the manor's windows, Thomas could swear he saw movement in the upper floors, a shadow passing by the glass, a figure moving through rooms he knew were empty. The grandfather clock inside chimed 4 times, its deep bronze voice carrying across the grounds like a funeral bell. Samuel was dead. Had been dead for days. And yet someone, or something, continued to care for Merrick Manor as if nothing had changed at all. Have you ever returned to a childhood home only to feel like you were the stranger there? Thomas burst through the kitchen door, his breath coming in sharp bursts that misted in the suddenly cold air. The pot still simmered on the stove, the bread still sat warm on the counter, but now these domestic touches felt like accusations. Someone had to be here. Someone had to explain. Mrs. Blackwood. His voice cracked as he shouted through the house. Mrs. Blackwood, I know you're here. Footsteps echoed from somewhere above, slow, measured steps that seemed to come from the servants' quarters. Thomas took the back stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding against his ribs. The narrow staircase that had once seemed like a secret passage during childhood games now felt like a trap, the walls pressing closer with each step. He reached the 3rd floor landing and saw her, Elizabeth Blackwood, exactly as he remembered. Her gray hair was pulled back in its customary severe bun, her black dress pristine despite the day's work. She stood at the end of the hallway, holding a bundle of fresh linens, watching him with eyes that held no surprise at his presence. "Master Thomas," she said, her voice carrying that same crisp authority he remembered from childhood. "I was just preparing the guest rooms. We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" Thomas struggled to catch his breath. "Mrs. Blackwood, Samuel he's dead." "Yes, I know." She said it with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. 3 days now. Perhaps 4. Time moves strangely in this house, don't you think? Thomas stared at her, his mind reeling. "You know. Then why is everything maintained?" Mrs. Blackwood moved past him toward the linen closet, her movements precise and economical. "Because the house must be kept. The family must be served. These things don't end simply because one member departs." "Departs?" Thomas grabbed her arm, spinning her to face him. Her flesh felt cold even through the fabric of her dress. "He didn't depart, Mrs. Blackwood. He killed himself. He's hanging from the oak tree behind the house." Her pale blue eyes met his without flinching. "Is that what you think happened?" "I saw him. I saw the rope." "You saw what Master Samuel wanted you to see." She pulled free from his grasp with surprising strength. "What he needed you to see. The question is whether you're prepared to understand why." Thomas followed her down the hallway, past doors he'd never been allowed to open as a child. "What are you talking about?" "Samuel wrote to me about estate business. He said there were matters that required my attention." "And so there are." Mrs. Blackwood paused before a door Thomas didn't recognize, one that somehow hadn't been there during his childhood explorations. "Tell me, Master Thomas, what do you remember about your father's death?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "Father died of pneumonia." "You know that. You were here." "I was here," she agreed. "I've been here for 40 years, since before you were born. I was here when your grandfather passed. I was here when his father passed before him. I've served 5 generations of Merrick men, Master Thomas. Do you think that's natural?" She opened the door and gestured for him to enter. The room beyond was small and spartanly furnished, a bed, a chair, a simple wooden table. But the walls were covered with something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. Photographs. Dozens of them, spanning decades. Images of the Merrick family through the years, formal portraits and candid moments. But they weren't arranged chronologically. Instead, they seemed to follow some other pattern, some logic that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand on end. "Your father didn't die of pneumonia," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. "Neither did your grandfather. Neither did his father before him." She moved to the wall, her finger tracing the faces in the photographs. "Each died on his 30th birthday. Each died exactly as he was meant to." Thomas studied the photographs with growing horror. There was his grandfather, William Merrick, standing beside the oak tree in what looked like a formal ceremony. There was his great-grandfather, Jonathan, in similar circumstances. In each image, other family members surrounded them, wives, children, servants, but the men themselves looked wrong somehow. Their smiles were too rigid, their eyes too bright. "This is madness," Thomas whispered. "Father was 35 when he died. I remember." "Do you?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice was gentle now, almost maternal. "Or do you remember what you were told to remember? You were 15 when he passed, Master Thomas. Old enough to count years, but young enough to accept what the adults told you about those years." She moved to another photograph, this one showing a younger version of herself standing beside a man Thomas didn't recognize. "This was taken in 1774, she said. I was 25 then. How old do you think I am now, Master Thomas?" Thomas looked at her face, lined with age but not ancient, gray-haired but not frail. She looked perhaps 60, maybe 65. But if the photograph was real, if she'd truly been 25 in 1774, that would make her. Impossible, he breathed. Is it? She smiled, and for a moment her face seemed to shift, revealing something far older beneath the familiar features. You come from a very special family, Master Thomas. The Merricks have always been blessed with longevity, with prosperity, with influence beyond what their birth should have granted them. But such blessings always come with a price. Thomas backed toward the door, but found it had somehow closed behind him. The handle wouldn't turn under his trembling fingers. What price? Each generation, the firstborn son makes a choice. He can accept the family's gifts, the wealth, the power, the long life, or he can refuse them. But refusal comes with consequences. Not just for him, but for everyone he loves. She moved to the table and lifted something Thomas hadn't noticed before, a leather-bound journal, its covers worn smooth by countless hands. Your father chose to refuse. So did your grandfather. So did his father before him. They died on their 30th birthdays not because they were cursed, but because they chose to break a covenant that had sustained the family for generations. What covenant? The words came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Blackwood opened the journal and began to read in a voice that seemed to echo strangely in the small room. In the year of our Lord 1674, Jeremiah Merrick, do make this compact with the Ancient One who dwells beneath the earth and sea. In exchange for prosperity for my bloodline, for long life and influence beyond mortal measure, I pledge the willing sacrifice of each firstborn son upon his 30th year. Their bodies shall not rest in consecrated ground, but shall serve as vessels for the Ancient One's return to this realm. Thomas felt the room spinning around him. That's some colonial superstition. Some old folklore. Samuel found this journal 3 months ago, Mrs. Blackwood continued as if he hadn't spoken. Hidden in the old cellar beneath the house. He spent weeks reading it, understanding what it meant. Understanding what would be required of him. Samuel isn't the firstborn, Thomas said desperately. I am. I'm 3 years older. And you left. Her eyes fixed on his with terrible intensity. You ran away to Boston, to New York, to London. You abandoned your birthright, your responsibilities. In the eyes of the compact, Samuel became the firstborn by default. The journal fell from her hands, hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. He spent his last weeks preparing, Master Thomas. Reading the journal, performing the necessary rituals. He wanted to spare you the choice your father faced, the choice your grandfather faced. He killed himself to spare me. He sacrificed himself to fulfill the compact. There's a difference. Mrs. Blackwood moved to the window and gazed out at the oak tree, where Samuel's body still swayed in the autumn breeze. The question now is whether his sacrifice will be enough. Whether the Ancient One will accept a second son in place of the first. Thomas finally managed to wrench the door open and stumbled into the hallway. The walls seemed to pulse around him like the inside of some vast heart. Mrs. Blackwood's voice followed him as he ran toward the stairs. You can't leave again, Master Thomas. Not this time. The house won't let you go until the matter is settled. Until someone pays the price that's owed. He reached the main floor and burst through the front door, gasping for air that tasted of decay and winter. But even as he ran across the lawn, Samuel's words from 5 years ago echoed in his memory, words he dismissed at the time as the ramblings of a brother who'd always been too fond of ghost stories and local legends. The family has secrets, Thomas. Terrible secrets. Father tried to break free from them, and look what happened to him. Look what happens to all of us. Now, staring back at Merrick Manor as shadows began to lengthen across the grounds, Thomas realized that Samuel hadn't been raving. He'd been warning him. And now it was too late for warnings. The house watched him with glowing windows, patient and immutable as a grave. Thomas circled the manor 3 times before finding what Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned, a cellar entrance partially hidden by overgrown ivy on the building's north side. The wooden doors, heavy with age and moisture, groaned as he pulled them open. Stone steps descended into darkness that seemed to swallow his lantern's meager light. The air below ground was different, thick with the smell of earth and something else, something organic that made his stomach clench. Each step down felt like a descent into the earth's bowels, away from everything rational and safe. The walls were carved from living rock, and strange symbols had been etched into the stone at regular intervals. At the bottom of the stairs, Thomas found himself in a chamber larger than should have been possible. The cellar extended far beyond the house's footprint above, its ceiling supported by rough-hewn pillars that disappeared into the shadows. His lantern light picked out details that made no sense, alcoves carved into the walls, each containing objects that gleamed dully in the flickering flame. In the center of the chamber sat a stone table, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Upon it lay the journal Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned, along with other items, candles burned down to stubs, dried herbs Thomas couldn't identify, and what looked like old parchments covered in spidery handwriting. Thomas approached the table with reluctant steps. The journal lay open to a page dated 1813, written in Samuel's familiar hand. His younger brother's final words, set down in careful script that betrayed no hint of madness or desperation. I, Samuel Merrick, second son made first by abandonment, do accept the burden laid upon my bloodline. The compact must be honored. The ancient one must be fed. I go willingly to my fate, that others might live. Thomas turned the pages backward, his hands shaking as he read entry after entry spanning generations. Each Merrick firstborn had contributed to this terrible record, documenting their understanding of the family's curse, their struggles with the choice they faced, and ultimately their submission to forces beyond human comprehension. His father's entry was there, dated 1808, I cannot do this thing. I will not feed my soul to whatever darkness my ancestor awakened. Elizabeth tells me the consequences, but I choose to face them rather than perpetuate this evil. May God forgive us all. His grandfather's words from 1778, the thing that calls itself our benefactor grows stronger with each passing year. I see it in my dreams now, vast and hungry, pressing against the barriers that separate its realm from ours. But I will not be the one to tear down those barriers. I will not be the key that opens the door. Page after page of refusal, generation after generation of Merrick men choosing death over submission. But the earliest entries told a different story. Jeremiah Merrick's original compact, written in 1674, was not the desperate bargain Mrs. Blackwood had read aloud. It was something far worse, a detailed record of communion with something that should never have been contacted by human minds. The Ancient One showed me visions of what was and what shall be, Jeremiah had written. I saw the colony's destruction, disease, starvation, savages rising from the forests to claim what we had built. But I also saw another path. Prosperity beyond imagining. Influence that would spread across continents. Life extended far beyond mortal limits. All for the simple price of acknowledging our true master. Thomas read on, his horror growing with each revelation. The early Merricks hadn't just made a pact, they had served willingly, enthusiastically. They had built this chamber, performed rituals that defied comprehension, and offered themselves gladly to sustain whatever waited in the spaces between spaces. The sacrifice is not death, Jeremiah had written. It is transformation. Each firstborn becomes a conduit, an anchor point that allows our patron to touch this world. Their bodies are preserved, their consciousness expanded beyond human limitations. They become something greater than mere men. The journal contained detailed instructions for the preservation process, methods that made Thomas's skin crawl. The bodies weren't simply embalmed, they were prepared through rituals that supposedly maintained not just their physical forms, but some essential aspect of their being. They were meant to serve as vessels, waiting for the day when the Ancient One would need them. Thomas looked up from the journal and truly saw the chamber for the first time. Those weren't alcoves carved into the walls, they were crypts. And in each crypt stood a glass case, perfectly clear and seemingly untouched by time. Within each case lay a figure in formal dress, hands folded, eyes closed, looking for all the world as if they were merely sleeping. His lantern light moved from case to case, revealing the faces of men he'd known only through portraits. There was his grandfather, William, looking exactly as he had in life but with an unnatural stillness that spoke of something beyond death. His great-grandfather, Jonathan. His great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel. On and on, stretching back through the generations. But as Thomas moved deeper into the chamber, he noticed something that froze his blood. The eyes of the preserved figures weren't quite closed. They were slightly open, just enough to reveal dark pupils that seemed to track his movement through the chamber. "You see them now." Mrs. Blackwood's voice came from behind him, though he hadn't heard her approach. "The true inheritors of the Merrick legacy. They aren't gone, Master Thomas. They're waiting." Thomas spun around, nearly dropping his lantern. Mrs. Blackwood stood at the chamber's entrance, but she looked different in the underground darkness. Older, more angular, her features sharper than they had been upstairs. Waiting for what? For their time to return. She moved between the glass cases like a caretaker tending her charges. The compact was never about death, you see. It was about transcendence. Each generation, the firstborn joins the ranks of the Watchers, the guardians who maintain the barriers between worlds. But there will come a time when those barriers fail, when the Ancient One needs soldiers in this realm. When that happens, they will all wake. Thomas backed away from her, the journal still clutched in his hands. Samuel refused this. He killed himself rather than. Samuel tried to cheat the compact, Mrs. Blackwood interrupted. He thought that by dying on his own terms, he could spare you the choice while still satisfying the Ancient One's hunger. But suicide was never part of the agreement. The sacrifice must be willing, yes, but it must also be purposeful. It must serve the greater design. She gestured to the walls, and Thomas saw that every glass case bore a nameplate. The most recent read, William Merrick, 1748 to 1778, but there was another case beyond it, still empty, its nameplate gleaming with fresh engraving, Thomas Merrick, 1783 to 1813. "Your 30th birthday is tomorrow," Mrs. Blackwood said softly. "Samuel's death has bought you nothing except time to understand what's at stake. The choice is still yours to make." Thomas looked from his own waiting tomb to the journal in his hands, then to the figures watching from their glass prisons. 3 generations of his family had refused this fate, choosing death over whatever transformation awaited in those cases. But the journal made it clear that their refusal had consequences beyond their own deaths. Each time a firstborn refused the compact, the family's supernatural protection weakened. Crops failed, businesses collapsed, family members died young of mysterious ailments. The Ancient One's displeasure manifested in ways both subtle and terrible, slowly strangling the Merrick line until it produced another firstborn willing to pay the price. "If I refuse," Thomas said quietly, "what happens to the family that remains?" Mrs. Blackwood's smile was sad and knowing. "Your sister Margaret has 3 children. 2 daughters and a son. Young William is 8 years old now, a bright boy with your father's eyes. In 22 years, he'll face the same choice you face today. But if you continue your family's tradition of refusal, if you let the compact weaken further." She shook her head. There may not be a family left for him to save. Thomas set the journal back on the stone table, his hands trembling. The candles around it flared suddenly, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls. For a moment, those shadows seemed to take shape, vast, writhing forms that pressed against the boundaries of the visible world. "Show me," he whispered. "Show me what happens if I accept." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes reflected the candlelight like mirrors. "Are you certain you want to know?" Thomas nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to run. She placed her hand on the journal and began to speak words in a language that predated human civilization. The shadows on the walls grew deeper, more substantial, until Thomas could see something vast and alien moving within them. The Ancient One was there, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between words, patient as stone and hungry as fire. And in that moment of contact, Thomas understood. He saw the truth of the compact, the real price of his family's prosperity, and the terrible purpose that awaited every firstborn son who accepted his fate. He also saw what would happen if he refused. Thomas fled the cellar as dawn broke over Merrick Manor, but the visions followed him. They seared themselves into his mind with perfect clarity, images of Margaret's children wasting away from inexplicable illnesses, of the family's fortune crumbling as supernatural misfortune struck their investments, of young William growing up in poverty and desperation before facing his own impossible choice at 30. He burst through the manor's front door gasping for air that tasted clean after the underground chamber's oppressive atmosphere. But even in the morning sunlight, the house felt different now. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound carried an undertone of something watching, waiting. "You cannot escape what you've seen." Thomas spun around to find Mrs. Blackwood standing in the foyer, looking exactly as she had during his childhood, no trace of the ancient, terrible thing he'd glimpsed in the cellar. She held a silver tray with tea and fresh bread, as if this were any normal morning in a normal house. "I don't believe any of it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Ancient entities, family compacts, it's madness. Superstition from a more ignorant time." "Then explain, Samuel." She set the tray on the hall table with deliberate precision. "Explain how I've maintained this house alone for 3 days while his body hangs from that tree. Explain how the fires keep burning, how the food keeps appearing, how the rooms stay clean without any human hand to tend them." Thomas had no answer. He'd been trying not to think about these impossibilities, focusing instead on the larger horror of what he'd discovered underground. But Mrs. Blackwood was right, the simple fact of the house's maintenance should have been impossible with Samuel dead and no other servants visible. "You haven't seen anyone else, have you?" she continued. "No gardeners, no kitchen staff, no stable boys. Just me. Just the woman who's been caring for this family since before you were born, who somehow never ages, who somehow knows things no mortal person should know." A door slammed somewhere in the upper floors, followed by the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. Thomas looked toward the stairs, but Mrs. Blackwood didn't seem to notice the noise. "That's your father," she said casually, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "He walks the halls sometimes, especially when important decisions need to be made. The dead don't rest easily when the living refuse their responsibilities." Another door slammed, this one closer. The footsteps moved down the hallway above them, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversation, multiple voices speaking in urgent, overlapping tones. "And your grandfather? Your great-grandfather? They're all here, Thomas. They've been here since the day they died, bound to this house by their refusal to honor the compact. Death didn't free them, it trapped them." The whispers grew louder, and Thomas could almost make out words. Arguments, pleas, warnings, the voices of dead Merrick men debating something with desperate intensity. The footsteps multiplied until it sounded like a crowd moving through the upper floors. "They want to tell you something," Mrs. Blackwood said, offering him a cup of tea. They've been waiting 15 years for you to return, to understand what they couldn't make you see as a boy. Thomas took the cup with shaking hands. The tea was perfect, exactly as he remembered from childhood, with just the right amount of sugar and cream. What do they want to say? That they were wrong. Her voice carried a sadness that seemed to echo from the depths of centuries. Every generation, they chose what they thought was the moral path. They refused to serve darkness, refused to perpetuate what they saw as evil. But their refusal didn't end the compact, it only delayed it, weakening the family's protection and ensuring that future generations would face even worse consequences. The footsteps above them stopped suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence. Then, slowly, they began moving toward the stairs. The Ancient One grows stronger with each refusal, Mrs. Blackwood continued. Each time a Merrick firstborn dies without fulfilling the compact, the barriers between worlds grow thinner. What began as a simple agreement, prosperity in exchange for service, has become something far more dangerous. The entity your ancestor contacted is preparing for something, Thomas. Something that will require not just one willing vessel, but an army of them. Thomas set down his teacup as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. He could see nothing, but he felt their presence, multiple figures descending toward the foyer, their invisible feet making no sound on the steps despite the clear sound of their approach. If you accept the compact, Mrs. Blackwood said quietly, you join them in their preservation. Your consciousness expands, your perception deepens, but you remain bound to this place and its purpose. If you refuse, you die as they died, but the compact doesn't end. It passes to the next firstborn, and the cycle continues with even greater urgency. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Thomas felt the air around him grow cold, and suddenly he could see them, translucent figures in the clothes of their respective eras, their faces bearing the unmistakable Merrick features. His father, looking exactly as Thomas remembered him. His grandfather, stern and disapproving. Generation after generation of men who had faced this same terrible choice. Tell him, Mrs. Blackwood commanded, and suddenly Thomas could hear their voices clearly. We thought we were protecting you. His father's spirit stepped forward, his face twisted with regret. We thought that by refusing, we were sparing future generations from this curse. But we only made it worse. The Ancient One feeds on refusal as much as acceptance, added his grandfather. Each death without fulfillment strengthens its hold on our world. We are not free, Thomas. We are prisoners, trapped between life and death, watching as our choices doom our descendants. More voices joined in, overlapping in a chorus of remorse and warning. The compact was meant to be cyclical, one generation serves, the next is free. But our refusals broke the cycle. Now it demands payment from every generation until the debt is settled. Young William will face this choice, and his son after him, and his son after that, unless someone pays what is owed. Thomas looked around at the assembled spirits of his ancestors, his mind reeling. What exactly does acceptance mean? What would happen to me? His father's ghost gestured toward the cellar entrance. Your body would be preserved, your consciousness expanded beyond human limitations. You would become a guardian, a watcher, maintaining the barriers that keep the Ancient One contained. It is not death, Thomas, it is transformation into something greater and more terrible than human existence. But you would save the family, his grandfather added. The compact would be fulfilled, the cycle completed. Margaret's children would live normal lives, free from supernatural interference. The Merrick name would prosper without requiring such sacrifices from future generations. Unless the barriers fail entirely, whispered another voice, one Thomas didn't recognize. Unless the Ancient One decides it no longer needs human servants. Then all bets are off. Mrs. Blackwood moved to stand beside the gathering of spirits, her form seeming to flicker between human and something else entirely. The choice must be made by sunset tomorrow, Thomas. On your 30th birthday. If you try to leave before then, the house will not permit it. And if you refuse. She gestured to the assembled ghosts. You'll join them in their eternal regret. The spirits began to fade as daylight strengthened, their voices becoming whispers, then silence. But Thomas could still feel their presence, their desperate hope that he might succeed where they had failed. He spent the day walking the grounds, trying to find some escape from the impossible situation. But Mrs. Blackwood had spoken truly. Every attempt to leave the estate grounds resulted in a strange disorientation that left him back where he started, as if the very land itself was determined to keep him there. As evening approached, Thomas found himself standing beneath the oak tree where Samuel's body still hung, now beginning to show signs of decay despite the November cold. His brother had tried to cheat the compact, to sacrifice himself without accepting the transformation. But even in death, he had failed to free the family from their supernatural burden. "I'm sorry, Samuel," Thomas whispered to the corpse. "I understand now why you thought death was preferable. But you were wrong about the solution." As darkness fell, Thomas made his decision. Not out of courage, but out of love for the family he'd abandoned 15 years ago. Margaret's face swam before his eyes, her laugh, her kindness, the way she'd wept when he left for Boston. Her children, innocent of their family's dark history, deserved a chance at normal lives. He would give them that chance, whatever the cost to himself. But first, he needed to understand exactly what that cost would be. And for that, he would need to descend once more into the chamber beneath Merrick Manor, to face the Ancient One directly and learn the full truth of what awaited him in that glass case bearing his name. The house seemed to sigh around him as he made this resolution, and for the first time since his return, the shadows felt less hostile than expectant. Thomas descended into the cellar as the grandfather clock above chimed 11 times, each bronze note seeming to echo endlessly in the underground chamber. The candles on the stone table had burned lower, their flames casting wild shadows that danced across the glass cases like living things. The preserved figures of his ancestors appeared more restless now, their slightly open eyes following his movements with unmistakable awareness. He approached the journal with steady steps, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The leather binding felt warm under his fingers, as if it had been resting near a fire. The pages fell open to a section he hadn't seen before, instructions written in Jeremiah Merrick's careful script, dated the night before his transformation. "The summoning requires absolute commitment," Thomas read aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "Half measures and hesitation will result in madness, not transcendence. The Ancient One can smell fear and doubt across the void between worlds. Only through complete surrender can the covenant be properly fulfilled." As he spoke these words, the temperature in the chamber dropped precipitously. His breath began to mist, and frost appeared on the glass cases containing his ancestors. But their preserved forms showed no signs of cold. If anything, they seemed more animated, as if the approaching ritual was awakening something within them. "You're ready, then." Mrs. Blackwood's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to emanate from the stones themselves. "I wondered if you would find the courage your father and grandfather lacked." Thomas looked around but couldn't see her. The chamber felt larger than before, its walls stretching away into shadows that his lantern couldn't penetrate. "Where are you?" "I am where I have always been, Thomas. Where I was 40 years ago when your father was born, where I was 40 years before that when your grandfather drew his first breath. I am the constant in this equation, the thread that connects all the generations of your family to their purpose." The candles on the stone table flared suddenly, their flames reaching toward the ceiling with unnatural intensity. In their light, Thomas saw that the chamber had indeed expanded, or perhaps his perception of it had changed. The glass cases now formed a perfect circle around the central table, and in each case, the preserved figures had opened their eyes fully. "We've been waiting so long," whispered his father's voice, though the lips in the glass case didn't move. So very long for someone to complete what we started. The compact was never meant to be broken, added his grandfather. Each refusal weakened the barriers, made the Ancient One hungrier, more desperate. Now it requires not just willing service, but active participation in its return to this realm. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold. Return? I thought the covenant was about keeping it contained, not bringing it back. Laughter echoed through the chamber, not human laughter, but something vast and alien that made the stone walls vibrate. The shadows between the glass cases began to move, coalescing into a shape that hurt to look at directly. Too many angles, too many limbs, too many eyes that burned with the light of dying stars. Foolish child, the Ancient One spoke through 1,000 mouths that weren't there. Did you think this was about containment? This was always about preparation. About creating the perfect vessels for my return to a world that has forgotten the old ways. The entity's presence filled the chamber like flood water, pressing against Thomas's mind with memories that weren't his own. He saw the early colonial period through inhuman eyes, watched as his ancestor Jeremiah made first contact during a particularly harsh winter. But the images revealed a truth far different from what the journal had implied. Jeremiah hadn't summoned the Ancient One to save his family from starvation. He had been chosen, marked from birth as a bloodline suitable for hosting something that required human form to operate in this reality. The prosperity, the longevity, the supernatural protection, these had never been gifts. They were investments, ways of ensuring the Merrick line would survive and thrive until the time came for the Ancient One to reclaim what it had been preparing for centuries. Each preserved firstborn becomes an anchor point, the entity continued, its voice now coming from the mouths of Thomas's ancestors. A foundation stone in the bridge between worlds. But the bridge was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to provide passage for my return to corporeal existence. Thomas backed away from the central table, but found his path blocked by glass cases that hadn't been there moments before. New figures stood within them, Merrick men he didn't recognize, their preservation dating back centuries. The chamber had become a vast mausoleum, filled with generations of his family stretching back to the very beginning of the colonial settlement. Your ancestor promised me his bloodline, the Ancient One said. Not just one generation, but all generations until I chose to collect what was owed. The debt has compounded over the centuries, grown beyond simple service into something far more profound. I require not just your body, Thomas Merrick, but your complete essence. Your soul will become the final component needed to anchor my consciousness permanently in this reality. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't about joining his ancestors in some transformed state of existence. This was about being consumed entirely, used as fuel for something that wanted to wear human flesh while wielding powers that belonged to older, darker realms. And if I refuse, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Your family dies. The Ancient One's response came from his father's preserved lips. Not just Margaret and her children, but every Merrick descendant across the continent. I have been patient for centuries, but my patience has limits. Complete the covenant willingly, and they live normal, prosperous lives. Refuse, and watch them burn from the inside out as supernatural forces consume them one by one. To prove its point, the entity showed him visions that made his knees buckle. Margaret screaming as invisible flames consumed her flesh. Her children writhing in agony as their bones twisted into impossible shapes. Dozens of Merrick cousins, aunts, uncles, people Thomas had never met but who shared his blood, dying in ways that defied natural law. You have until dawn, the Ancient One said, its presence beginning to withdraw. Use the remaining hours to prepare yourself, to say whatever goodbyes you feel necessary. But understand that this choice is not truly a choice at all. It is an inevitability that has been building for over a century. The oppressive presence faded, leaving Thomas alone in the chamber with his preserved ancestors. But they were no longer the regretful, warning spirits he had encountered upstairs. Now they looked at him with expressions of hunger and anticipation, their slightly open eyes burning with the same alien intelligence he had seen in the Ancient One's vast form. "Join us," they whispered in unison. "Complete what we could not. Bridge the gap between worlds and usher in the new age." Thomas stumbled toward the chamber's exit, his mind reeling from what he had learned. The covenant wasn't about protection or service, it was about invasion. The Ancient One had been using his family as unwitting collaborators in its plan to establish a permanent foothold in human reality. Every preserved ancestor wasn't a guardian maintaining barriers, but a component in some vast supernatural machine designed to facilitate cosmic horror. He emerged from the cellar to find the house transformed. Every light blazed with unnatural intensity, and the air hummed with barely contained energy. Mrs. Blackwood stood in the foyer, but her human disguise had fallen away entirely. Her true form was something that predated human civilization, tall, angular, with features that shifted between familiar and utterly alien depending on the angle of observation. "Now you know," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Thomas's teeth ache. "The real purpose behind everything. Your family has been cultivated for this moment, Thomas. Bred and shaped and prepared to serve as the perfect vessel for something greater than human comprehension." Thomas looked around at the house that had been his childhood home, seeing it now for what it truly was, not a family estate, but a temple. Every room, every corridor, every piece of furniture had been arranged according to some inhuman design, creating a structure that would facilitate the Ancient One's transition from its realm to this one. "I won't do it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I won't be part of bringing that thing into our world." Mrs. Blackwood smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "Then you condemn not just your family, but potentially your entire species. The Ancient One grows stronger whether you comply or resist. Your willing participation simply makes the transition smoother, less catastrophic for the world at large." She gestured toward the windows, and Thomas saw that the dawn was beginning to break on the horizon. His 30th birthday had arrived, and with it, the deadline for his decision. But even as he faced this impossible choice, a new plan began to form in his mind. If the covenant truly required willing participation, if half measures and hesitation led to madness rather than successful transcendence, then perhaps there was a third option. Something his ancestors had never considered in their desperate attempts to either escape or fulfill their supernatural obligations. The question was whether he had the courage to attempt something that might destroy not just himself, but everything the Ancient One had worked centuries to achieve. If you learned your entire family's fortune was built on such a horrific sacrifice, would you honor the pact or break it? Dawn painted the sky the color of old blood as Thomas stood in his father's study, staring at the portrait of Jeremiah Merrick that hung above the fireplace. His ancestors' painted eyes seemed to follow him as he moved about the room, gathering items he hoped would serve his desperate purpose. A silver letter opener that had belonged to his grandfather. A vial of his mother's laudanum, left untouched since her death from influenza 10 years prior. And most importantly, the ceremonial dagger he'd found hidden in his father's desk, its blade etched with symbols that matched those carved into the cellar walls. Mrs. Blackwood materialized in the doorway, her inhuman features now barely concealed by the facade of human appearance. "Preparing for the ceremony?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew his true intentions. "In a manner of speaking." Thomas slipped the dagger into his coat. "Tell me, what happens if the willing participant dies before the transformation can be completed? Not suicide to avoid the covenant, but death during the actual ritual." Her eyes narrowed to slits that reflected light like a cat's. "Such an occurrence has never been recorded. The Ancient One chooses its vessels carefully, ensures they are strong enough to survive the process of transcendence." "But theoretically," Thomas pressed, "if someone were to die at the exact moment of contact, not before, not after, but during the precise instant when the entity attempts to take possession, what would be the result? Mrs. Blackwood's form flickered, revealing something vast and terrible underneath her human disguise. You play a dangerous game, Thomas Merrick. The Ancient One can hear your thoughts, sense your intentions. If you attempt to sabotage the covenant, then let it listen. Thomas moved to the window and looked out at Samuel's body, still hanging from the oak tree after 4 days. My brother tried to cheat by dying before his obligations could be fulfilled. My father and grandfather tried to cheat by refusing outright. But none of them considered the possibility of dying during the moment of transition itself. He turned back to face Mrs. Blackwood, his resolve hardening. If I'm reading the journal correctly, the transformation requires a complete merging of consciousness, the Ancient One's essence joining with mine at the precise moment my human awareness expands to accommodate it. But what if there's nothing left to join with? What if my consciousness simply ceases at the exact instant of contact? The temperature in the room plummeted, and frost began forming on the windows. Mrs. Blackwood's facade cracked entirely, revealing the ancient, inhuman thing that had been manipulating his family for generations. You would risk everything on a theory? Risk your family's lives, risk unleashing uncontrolled supernatural forces? The Ancient One is coming regardless, Thomas replied. You said so yourself, my willing participation only makes the transition smoother. If I refuse, it finds another way. If I flee, it destroys my family and finds another bloodline. The only variable I can control is the manner of my cooperation. He walked past her toward the cellar entrance, the ceremonial dagger heavy in his coat. If my theory is correct, if I can disrupt the transformation at the critical moment, then perhaps I can trap the Ancient One between realms, partially manifested but without a proper vessel to anchor it in this reality. Mrs. Blackwood followed him, her movements becoming increasingly inhuman with each step. And if you're wrong? If your death simply delays the inevitable while condemning your family to supernatural retribution? Thomas paused at the top of the cellar stairs. Then I'll have failed no more completely than my ancestors did. But at least I'll have tried something they never considered. The descent into the chamber felt like a journey to his own execution. The preserved figures in their glass cases watched his approach with expressions that had shifted from anticipation to something approaching concern. Even they, it seemed, could sense that something had changed in the equation. The journal lay open on the stone table, its pages now revealing text that hadn't been there before, instructions in the Ancient One's own alien script, describing the precise ritual requirements for the transformation. Thomas read them carefully, noting the specific timing, the required mental state, the exact moment when human consciousness was supposed to expand to accommodate its supernatural guest. That would be when he struck. You understand, he said to the watching figures of his ancestors, that if this works, you'll remain trapped in those cases forever. There will be no release, no eventual awakening. You'll be conscious but immobile until the glass breaks and your preserved bodies finally decay. His father's voice whispered from within the case, filled with something that might have been relief. Better eternal imprisonment than eternal servitude to that thing. If you can prevent it from using our bloodline to establish its foothold in this world, then our suffering will have served some purpose. Thomas nodded and began the ritual preparations. Candles were lit according to the journal's specifications. Symbols were drawn on the floor using chalk mixed with his own blood. Words were spoken in the ancient language that preceded human civilization, each syllable feeling like a violation of natural law. As the ritual progressed, the chamber began to change. The walls became translucent, revealing glimpses of the space between worlds where the Ancient One waited. Reality became fluid, uncertain, as the barriers between realms grew thin enough for something vast and alien to press through. The entity's presence filled the chamber gradually, its consciousness seeping into the physical space like water through cracks in stone. Thomas felt his own awareness beginning to expand, his perception stretching beyond human limitations as the transformation began. This was the moment. The precise instant when his consciousness was most vulnerable, most open to invasion. The Ancient One reached across the void between worlds, its alien intelligence preparing to flood into the vessel that had been prepared for it across generations. Thomas gripped the ceremonial dagger and drove it deep into his own heart. Pain exploded through his chest, but he held on to consciousness just long enough to feel the Ancient One's shock and rage as its carefully planned invasion found nothing to inhabit. His expanding awareness, the very thing that was supposed to accommodate the entity's presence, collapsed like a punctured balloon. The bridge between worlds, built from centuries of preparation and supernatural manipulation, crumbled as its keystone component died at the critical moment. The last thing Thomas heard before darkness claimed him was the Ancient One's scream of frustrated fury, echoing across dimensions as its pathway to human reality slammed shut with the finality of a tomb door sealing. Mrs. Blackwood found his body the next morning, sprawled across the ritual circle with the dagger protruding from his chest and an expression of grim satisfaction frozen on his face. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive presence that had dominated it for so long simply gone. The preserved figures in their glass cases remained motionless, their eyes finally closed in something that might have been peace. The covenant was broken. Not through refusal or evasion, but through the ultimate sacrifice, one that denied the Ancient One its prize while freeing future generations from supernatural obligation. The Merrick bloodline would continue, but no longer as unwilling servants to cosmic horror. But Thomas's victory came with a price beyond his own life. The sudden disruption of forces that had been building for centuries created ripples that would be felt for generations. The house itself began to change, its supernatural enhancements fading as the entity that had sustained them withdrew to lick its wounds in whatever realm it called home. Mrs. Blackwood, her purpose finally fulfilled after serving 5 generations of Merrick men, began to age rapidly. Her artificially extended lifespan collapsed like a house of cards, and within hours she had crumbled to dust that scattered in the November wind. The estate fell into ruin with supernatural speed. Without the Ancient One's protection, the wealth that had sustained the family for generations evaporated. The servants who had maintained the grounds disappeared, and the house itself began to decay as if making up for centuries of unnatural preservation. But in Boston, Margaret Merrick received a letter from the family's lawyers informing her that her brother Thomas had died peacefully in his sleep, leaving her a modest inheritance and a deed to property in Maine that she might choose to sell or abandon as she saw fit. Her children would grow up free from supernatural interference, their lives their own to shape. The oak tree behind Merrick Manor bore 2 bodies now, Samuel, who had tried to cheat fate, and Thomas, who had cheated it successfully. They swayed together in the autumn wind until the ropes finally rotted through and they fell to earth, where they were buried side by side in the family cemetery by the local constable who investigated their deaths. The official records listed both as suicides resulting from the financial pressures facing many New England families in the difficult years following the War of 1812. No mention was made of supernatural covenants, ancient entities, or the price that had been paid to keep cosmic horror from establishing a foothold in human reality. But sometimes, on nights when the wind blows just right through the ruins of Merrick Manor, visitors claim they can hear the sound of glass breaking in the cellar below. And in the town records, there is no trace that anyone named Elizabeth Blackwood ever lived or worked at the estate, despite 40 years of faithful service to a family that paid their debts in ways that defy human understanding. 6 months after Thomas Merrick's death, a young man named William Ashworth stepped off the coach in the village of Millbrook, Maine, carrying nothing but a worn travel bag and a letter from a Boston law firm. He was tall and lean with dark hair and penetrating eyes that marked him unmistakably as Merrick blood, though he bore his mother's surname and had never known his father's true identity. The letter in his pocket had arrived 3 weeks prior, informing him that he had inherited property from a recently deceased relative, a remote estate that came with a modest stipend and the curious condition that he take up residence there immediately to maintain his claim. For a young man of limited means and fewer prospects, it had seemed like providence. The villagers who directed him to Merrick Manor spoke in hushed tones about the place, crossing themselves and warning him about the strange deaths that had occurred there. But William was 23 years old and possessed of the particular type of confidence that comes from never having encountered anything truly unexplainable. He dismissed their superstitions as rural ignorance and set off down the overgrown path toward his inheritance. The manor itself was a disappointment. What the legal documents had described as a grand estate was clearly a house in decline. Paint peeled from the shutters, ivy had claimed much of the exterior walls, and several windows were broken. The grounds were overgrown with weeds, and the outbuildings showed signs of significant weather damage. William tried the front door and found it unlocked. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that revealed furniture covered in white sheets and rooms that smelled of disuse and decay. This was hardly the windfall he had hoped for, but it was shelter, and with some work it might be made habitable. He spent the first day exploring the house room by room, making mental notes of what would need to be repaired or replaced. The place was larger than it had appeared from outside, with more rooms than any reasonable family should need. Many of the chambers contained personal effects that suggested hasty abandonment, clothes still hanging in wardrobes, books left open on reading tables, half-finished letters on writing desks. In what appeared to be the master study, William found a portrait hanging above the fireplace that made him pause. The man in the painting bore a striking resemblance to his own features, though the clothing and style suggested it had been painted decades ago. A brass nameplate at the bottom of the frame read, "Thomas Merrick, 1783 to 1813. "So that's my benefactor," William murmured, studying the painted face. There was something unsettling about the portrait, the eyes seemed to follow his movement around the room, and the expression held a mixture of sadness and warning that made him uncomfortable. That evening, as William prepared a simple meal in the manor's kitchen, he heard footsteps in the rooms above. Slow, measured steps that moved from room to room as if someone were conducting their own exploration of the house. He called out, but received no answer. When he went to investigate, he found only empty rooms and settling dust. Over the following days, the mysterious footsteps became a regular occurrence. Always at night, always in the upper floors, always stopping whenever William tried to locate their source. He told himself it was merely the house settling, old wood responding to changes in temperature. But the sounds were too regular, too purposeful to be natural phenomena. On his 7th night in the manor, William discovered the cellar entrance. He had been searching for the source of a persistent draft when he noticed the ivy-covered doors on the building's north side. The wooden barriers opened reluctantly, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. His lantern illuminated a chamber far larger than should have been possible, its walls lined with empty alcoves that looked as if they had once contained something important. Broken glass littered the floor, and in the center of the space sat a stone table bearing the remains of old candles and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. William approached the table with growing curiosity. The journal was filled with entries spanning several generations, all bearing the Merrick name. The handwriting varied from entry to entry, but the content followed a consistent theme, references to family obligations, supernatural forces, and a covenant that bound the bloodline to serve something called the Ancient One. Fascinating, William murmured as he read. Some sort of family tradition, perhaps. An elaborate genealogical record disguised as supernatural nonsense. But as he read deeper into the journal, his academic detachment began to waver. The entries were too detailed, too consistent across generations to be mere fiction. They described real events, real people, real consequences for those who failed to meet their supernatural obligations. The final entry was dated November 30th, 1813, written in a hand that perfectly matched the signature on William's inheritance documents. "I go now to face what my ancestors could not in submission, but in defiance. If this gambit succeeds, the covenant dies with me. If it fails, may God forgive us all for what we have unleashed. To whoever finds this record, know that the price of our prosperity was paid in ways that defy comprehension. The Merrick bloodline is free now, but freedom always comes with costs. Watch for the signs. Listen for the voices. And if the shadows begin to move of their own accord, run. William set down the journal, his hands trembling slightly. This was clearly the work of a disturbed mind, perhaps driven to madness by isolation and financial pressures. The strange sounds in the house, the feeling of being watched, the persistent sense that something was wrong, all of it could be explained by suggestion and an overactive imagination fed by these ridiculous ghost stories. But even as he told himself this, William noticed that the broken glass on the chamber floor wasn't randomly scattered. It formed rough outlines, as if several large rectangular objects had once stood in the alcoves and been shattered deliberately. And among the glass fragments, he could see what looked like pieces of brass nameplate, bearing partial inscriptions in the Merrick family name. William. The voice came from somewhere in the chamber, though William could see no one else present. It was a man's voice, cultured and concerned, with an accent that suggested education and breeding. Who's there? William spun around, his lantern casting wild shadows on the chamber walls. You shouldn't be here, the voice continued. Not yet. You're too young, the covenant was specific about age requirements. Show yourself. William demanded, though his voice cracked slightly. A figure began to materialize in one of the empty alcoves, translucent but clearly defined, wearing clothes from the early years of the century. The face was unmistakably similar to William's own, and to the portrait hanging in the study above. Thomas Merrick, the spirit said, inclining his head in a formal bow. And you must be William Ashworth, my sister's son. You have her eyes, but the Merrick jaw. I had hoped the bloodline's supernatural obligations had died with me, but it seems I was overly optimistic. William backed toward the chamber's exit, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This is impossible. Ghosts don't exist. This is some sort of hallucination brought on by stress and suggestion. I thought the same thing once, Thomas replied sadly. Right up until I found myself trapped between life and death, bound to this place by forces I couldn't escape or understand. Tell me, William, have you experienced anything unusual since arriving here? Strange sounds, perhaps. The sensation of being watched. Against his better judgment, William found himself nodding. Footsteps in the upper floors. Doors opening and closing by themselves. The feeling that someone else is living in the house. Not someone, Thomas corrected. Several someones. The ghosts of Merrick men who died rather than fulfill their supernatural obligations. We're all here, William, father, grandfather, great-grandfather. Trapped in this place until the family's dead is finally settled. More figures began to appear in the empty alcoves, translucent men in clothing from different eras, all bearing unmistakable family resemblances. They watched William with expressions of pity and concern, their faces bearing the marks of men who had died before their time. What debt? William asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Thomas gestured to the journal on the stone table. Read the early entries. Understand what our ancestor Jeremiah agreed to in 1674. The covenant that bound our bloodline to serve something that should never have been contacted by human minds. But you broke it, William protested, scanning Thomas's final journal entry. You said the covenant died with you. I thought I had broken it, Thomas agreed. I believed that by disrupting the transformation at the critical moment, I had severed the family's connection to the Ancient One permanently. But supernatural compacts are not so easily dissolved. The entity retreated, wounded but not destroyed. It has spent these past months healing, adapting, finding new ways to claim what it believes is owed. The temperature in the chamber dropped suddenly, and the assembled spirits of dead Merrick men began to look around nervously. The shadows between the alcoves grew deeper, more substantial, until something vast and alien began to press through from whatever realm it inhabited. "It's here," whispered one of the spirits, William's grandfather, he realized. "It's found a way back." The Ancient One's presence filled the chamber like flood water, bringing with it the scent of things that had died eons before human civilization began. When it spoke, its voice came from 1,000 directions at once, each word carrying harmonics that made William's bones ache. "Did you think death would free you, Thomas Merrick? Did you think your pathetic sacrifice would end what your ancestor began? I am patient beyond your comprehension. I am persistent beyond your imagination. And I always collect what is owed." The entity's attention turned to William, and suddenly he could see it clearly, not as the towering shadow thing it had appeared to Thomas, but as something even more terrible. It wore the faces of every Merrick man who had ever lived, constantly shifting between features as if it couldn't decide which identity to claim. "This one will serve," it declared, studying William with eyes that held the light of dying stars. "Young enough to be shaped, old enough to understand consequences. The covenant will be fulfilled through this vessel, and the debts of 5 generations will finally be paid." "No," Thomas stepped between William and the entity, his ghostly form somehow more solid now. "He's not even 30. The original compact was specific, only firstborn sons on their 30th birthday." The Ancient One laughed, a sound like continents grinding together. "The compact has evolved, Thomas Merrick. Your interference damaged the original agreement, but it did not destroy it. Now I require payment with interest, not just one life, but active participation in my emergence into this realm. This young man will serve as my herald, preparing the way for my full manifestation." William felt the entity's influence pressing against his mind, offering visions of power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. He saw himself as a figure of tremendous influence, commanding supernatural forces, reshaping reality according to his will. All he had to do was accept the gift being offered, embrace his family's true destiny. But he also saw the truth hidden beneath these seductive images, the slow erosion of his humanity, the gradual replacement of his consciousness with something alien and hungry. The Ancient One didn't want a servant, it wanted a skin to wear while it worked to bring more of its kind into the human world. "I refuse," William said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. "Whatever my ancestor agreed to, I had no part in it. I won't be bound by contracts I never signed." "Then you will die as your predecessors died," the Ancient One replied. "And I will find another vessel." Margaret Merrick had 3 children, did she not? Young James is only 16, but he carries the bloodline. Perhaps he will prove more cooperative. The threat to his unknown cousin made William's decision for him. He couldn't escape this supernatural trap, but perhaps he could spring it in a way that protected others. If the Ancient One wanted a herald, a conscious participant in its plans, then perhaps willing cooperation could be turned into a weapon. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll serve as your herald, prepare the way for your manifestation. But I have conditions." Thomas's spirit looked at him with horror. "William, no. You don't understand what you're agreeing to." "I understand perfectly," William replied, his eyes never leaving the Ancient One's shifting features. "And I accept, with the condition that my family be left alone permanently. No future claims on the bloodline, no supernatural interference in their lives. This ends with me." The Ancient One considered his proposal, its alien intelligence weighing the benefits of willing cooperation against the satisfaction of eventual dominance over the entire family line. "Agreed," it said finally. "You will serve as my herald for 7 years, preparing the way for my full emergence. At the end of that time, your consciousness will be consumed entirely, and I will claim your body as my permanent vessel in this realm. In exchange, all other members of the Merrick bloodline will be freed from supernatural obligation. As the compact was sealed with words in a language that predated human speech, William felt the Ancient One's influence settle over him like a suffocating blanket. His consciousness remained intact for now, but he could feel the entity's presence growing stronger with each passing moment. The spirits of his ancestors watched in helpless sorrow as William was claimed by the very force they had spent their lives trying to escape. But unlike their refusals and rebellions, his sacrifice would actually accomplish something: 7 years to prepare, to plan, to find some way to turn the tables on an entity that had manipulated his family for generations. As the Ancient One's presence faded back to whatever realm it called home, leaving William alone with the weight of his new obligations, he picked up the journal from the stone table and added his own entry. I, William Ashworth Merrick, do accept the burden of herald to the Ancient One, that my family might finally be free. 7 years I have to find a way to destroy what should never have been awakened. 7 years to succeed where generations of Merrick men have failed. If anyone finds this record after my time has ended, know that I tried to break the cycle permanently. Whether I succeeded or failed, the choice will soon be out of mortal hands entirely. If you've followed the Merrick family to their endless curse, comment, the firstborn always pay the price.